Last time, Amy, Twitch, Nubby, and Fumbles had tracked the problem down to an infestation of what had appeared to be Tyranids. It turned out that they weren't proper Nids, though, since shortly after they'd been killed, the bug's remains had started reforming in a distinctly warpy fashion, and then they'd just sort of vanished when we'd finally de-warped. We decided that the whole thing had just been some sort of warp phenomena caused by the psychic containment in the cells failing, and the zoanthropes sort of passively screwing with reality. This explanation was ruined by the fact that despite the cells being all fixed up, the warpy Nids had come back. Or maybe they hadn't. It was all a bit of a mess. The problem was that this time the Tyranid-shaped creatures that Nubby drew out with his damsel in distress routine were different. They had an appearance and behavior that could best be described as ghost-like. Not ghost-like as in sneaky, but ghost-like as in like a ghost. Literally. Now, the occurrence border was practically littered with warp ghosts, but human ones. For the most part, they just wandered around reenacting their lives and deaths, with the occasional bout of unsettling whispering or screaming thrown in. They were harmless by and large, and even provided decent entertainment on slow days. But that could change if someone or something managed to get their attention and drag them into sync with what passed for reality. Anyway, the Tyranids we found literally haunting the fringes of the tainted areas displayed all the signs of being warp ghosts, except, Tyranid ones. They sort of milled around in the shadows, drifting through walls, making clicking noises at each other, and gnawing at stuff that wasn't there, until we got too close or had Fumbles poke 'em. Then every ghost Nid in the area would swarm in around the agitated one, and become an awful lot more solid until a few bolts of plasma blew them back into black and green smoke. At first, the ghost Tyranids were just puzzling. Based on the little we knew about the warp and what information our xenology adept could provide, it shouldn't have been possible. Your average Nid doesn't have a mind, much less a soul, and those are pretty much requirements for being a ghost. Otherwise, the warp would be littered with ghost bricks, trees, rocks, or whatever. Everyone agreed that something odd was going on, but no one could figure out exactly what it was. At first, we just blamed the zoanthrope, but Jim and Theo checked and couldn't detect any psychic energy leaking out of the cells, and Fumbles backed them up. Other theories were raised, such as the ghost Nids being a psychic projection based on the crew's collective unconscious fear of Tyranids, or them being the result of the hive mind reaching across the warp to smite us, or everything being caused by the ancient heathen insectoid idol stored in Cargo Bay E71/3, which had driven all who looked upon it insane. These were all shot down for various reasons, such as the fact that, according to old Bill, the idol's various limbs had been holding up a plasma conduit for 13 years now, without any significant problems. Twitch, of course, held fast to his theory that the Tyranids aboard the hive ship, which had been sucked into the warp by the Scythe's vortex bomb, had made an alliance with the demons of chaos, and an unstoppable tide of demonids would rampage across the galaxy. No one but Amy bothered to argue with him, and in the end, the rest of us just decided that the ghost Nids were probably still somehow the zoanthrope's fault, despite all the evidence to the contrary. To return to the point, though, the ghost Nids were puzzling at first. This wasn't because something happened which explained everything. It was because they quickly became far too serious a problem to waste time actually thinking about it. The number of ghost Tyranid sightings quickly rose, as did the number of attacks. We'd tried to nip the problem in the bud, of course. A busy 2 days had been spent antagonizing ethereal hormagaunts into solidity and then shooting them. Unfortunately, they didn't stay dead, even when we got the Confessor himself to come down and wave his censer around after we shot them. It'd take a few hours, but eventually a bug that Fumbles claimed was the same one would drift back into a spot where we'd killed it, and resume its seemingly random wandering. An expedition into the tainted areas to see where they were coming from was proposed, but after some careful thought, we decided that we didn't actually want to die horribly in a twisted nightmare of non-Euclidean geometry and bug-shaped warp monstrosities. We might have really considered it if the ghost Tyranids had seemed interested in launching attacks on the rest of the ship, but as far as we could tell, they were content to just sort of hang out. Over time, the steadily increasing number of ghost bugs would result in them wandering deeper into the ship, but otherwise they just stayed put unless someone got near them. Lacking any viable solution, or the motivation to take a real risk to find one, the captain agreed with our decision to just set up a kill zone around the tainted areas and contain the apathetic ghost Tyranid menace. The containment strategy wasn't sustainable in the long run, since the number of bugs was inexorably increasing, and they were able to expand in 3 dimensions as well as through walls, too. But we were pretty sure that if we gave a little ground when the numbers got too high, it'd work long enough for us to reach our next resupply point. Also, if things got really bad, we could always de-warp and sort things out at the expense of a few days of travel time. Since there wasn't any immediate crisis, we settled into a slightly more stressful than usual routine and got on with our lives. Amy assumed command of the entire lower aft portion of the defense. She didn't actually ask for permission or anything, mind you, she just walked down there and started bossing everyone around. The only reason that the captain and his master-at-arms didn't kick up a huge fuss about this blatant disrespect was that Amy was actually very good at this sort of thing, having been born and raised for infantry command before her career change to inquisitorial gooning. The rest of us noticed that despite how much she complained about the poor quality of her troops compared to her old regiment, Amy seemed far happier than she'd been since her disastrous mission with the half-mad Majos. Or, if not happier, at least less prone to spontaneous violence. Since Twitch, not to put too fine a point on it, wasn't really sane enough to command a squad, much less an entire flank of the defense, his assistance to the containment effort was a bit more ad hoc. He scampered around, shoring up defenses and setting up traps without any discernible rhyme or reason, and everyone else just had to adjust their deployments to fit. It was all surprisingly effective, though in retrospect it really shouldn't have been. He'd spent more time patrolling the borders of tainted areas than anyone except old Bill and his senior engineers, and knew which spots were defensible and which ones weren't by heart. Initially, Nubby just sort of mooched around the various fronts, assisting with the supply effort. But since his partner in petty crime was the only psyker around who wasn't busy steering the ship, this profitable arrangement didn't last. We'd quickly discovered that Fumble's ability to sense the ghost nids from quite far away and through walls was invaluable, especially since he could share what he sensed with anyone nearby. He was constantly in demand as a spotter, and Nubby was dragged along to act as backup and moral support. As has been mentioned, the rest of us had other things to do, and the ghost nid situation really didn't change that. I mean, if you stop work every time an army of warp-spawned insectoid spirits lays siege to your ship, you'll never get anything done. So we all just sort of muddled along, trying to hold everything together, as the trip continued and things got progressively worse. In the case of Doc's treatment of Sergeant Gravis, got progressively worse is a perfect summary. The Space Marine's condition went steadily downhill, and not in the ways Doc or Valerie had been prepared for. There were seemingly random seizures, spikes in neural activity that indicated horrible nightmares, inexplicable changes in the behavior of the biotoxin, and even a few spontaneous mechanical failures in the life support machinery. It got to the point where Gravis watching was a 24-hour no distractions duty, because the second he was left alone, something would invariably go wrong. Doc, not being born yesterday, blamed all these problems on the warp in general and the zoanthrope in particular, but he couldn't figure out the why or how and had no idea what to do about it. Lacking any proactive treatment ideas aside from exiting the warp or killing the zoanthrope, Doc dedicated increasingly large portions of his time to Gravis watching, and developed a rather disturbing tendency to talk to the comatose Space Marine. Tasteless jokes about Valerie getting jealous aside, we began to worry about him. But we were getting near the end of the trip by the time things got really worrying, and he seemed to recover a bit after his theory about the zoanthrope being the cause was confirmed. Actually, it wasn't just Doc's theory that was proven. Our suspicions about there being a link between the ghost nids and the zoanthrope were confirmed too. What happened was that 3 days out from our destination, nearly a quarter of the psi suppressors in the cells failed at once. This didn't come as a complete surprise, mind you. Even in stasis, the zoanthrope's mere psychic presence, not to mention the warp itself, wore down the machinery and shielding that restrained it. Tink, Theo, and Jim had been dedicating more and more of their time to inspections and maintenance. But there was only so much that they could do given the general kludged-together nature of the cells. So they'd been sort of ready for something like this to happen, and had made sure that someone was always on duty. When the failure happened, Jim had been right there to start fixing things, and both Theo and Tink had arrived within minutes to help. Sarge showed up too, but he didn't really help in any meaningful way. He just really wanted an excuse to ditch the horrible, self-inflicted purgatory of his diplomacy lessons. Anyway, during the 15 or so minutes of reduced psi suppression on the zoanthrope, the following happened. The spawn rate of ghost nids drastically increased. A few higher life forms started appearing. The entire swarm began acting more in touch with reality and became significantly harder to kill. All sorts of warp phenomena occurred throughout the ship. The temperature on the main atmospheric regulator got stuck at 7 degrees. This was probably unrelated, but by then we were blaming everything on the damned bug. Fumbles suffered some sort of combination hallucinatory and convulsive episode, and wound up clawing at his face and breaking his goggles. The navigator sent us a very angry note about the importance of not distracting him while steering. Sergeant Gravis caught fire. Again. So yeah, it was a pretty unpleasant experience, especially since it was actually a minor failure compared to some of the stuff that had broken during our last trip, and therefore raised all sorts of questions about the zoanthrope's powers. Not that we had much time for pondering, though, because the following 3 days were absolutely exhausting. Most of the problems caused by the failure were dealt with immediately. The suppressors were repaired without the zoanthrope breaking out of stasis and trying to kill everyone. Doc actually had a fire extinguisher ready to put Gravis out before the eldritch flames did any real damage, and handled everything else that went spontaneously wrong during the brief loss of suppression. Nubby managed to restrain fumbles before he clawed out his own eyes, got the psyker to safety, and was even able to scrounge up another pair of extra-large welding goggles, which may or may not have had "Bills, do not steal" written on them. Lastly, thanks to a general retreat order by Amy and the captain, plus Twitch's suspiciously well-placed fallback points, relatively few men died to the temporarily empowered Ghost Nids. Unfortunately, even though the Ghost Nids lost focus and weakened again after the psi suppressors were back online, the increase in their numbers was permanent. Containment became significantly more difficult, especially since in some places, the defenses had been pushed back to rooms that old Bill said were important to the running of the ship. It wasn't a good situation, but then again, it could have been worse. Both ammo and food were plentiful. It wasn't snowing or raining, aside from the occasional drizzle of supernatural blood, and there weren't any commissars. On the official Imperial Guard scale of horrible meat-grinder defenses, it was about a 3. Of course, anything that even shows up on that scale isn't something you want to deal with while traveling through the warp.